Happy Disability Pride Month, everyone. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Priya, and I started this grassroots group, DIY Abled, about 6 years ago to inform people about disability. Before I was disabled, I was in a band and I was an artist that was part of a DIY community. And I still am today as a disabled person. People often ask me why I'm so drawn to a DIY community, and the reason is because if you don't have a voice, it's a place that allows you to create a space and make your voice heard. And in my lifetime of being part of this community, I've seen people of color, women, people from the LGBTQ community, poor people, and more all create spaces to make their voices heard, and it's really been wonderful to watch. But when I re-entered the DIY community, I didn't find the same opportunities for myself as a disabled person. There was this record store that I used to go to when I lived in the Bay Area, and let me explain to you how a DIY community works in case you're not familiar. So if you live in a city that participates in it, there's usually a venue, a record store, a storefront, someone's house, a place that hosts a touring band or touring artist, and then the local bands and artists perform or show at them and promote it. And that's how a DIY community is created. So this record store in the Bay Area that I used to go to, I didn't go there to buy records because it was completely inaccessible. If I wanted to buy records, I had to go look at the records like this or like this, all from a seated position, of course. And if I wanted to buy a record, I couldn't. There wasn't an accessible way for me to get to the register. So I didn't go there to buy records. I went there to see shows because the space where they had shows was mostly accessible. It had a doorway that was wide enough for my wheelchair and me to fit through, and I would go watch shows there. But this one night when I went there, the record store owner decided to take a record shelf and block half the doorway, therefore making it inaccessible for me. So I wanted to try something to see if people understood this. And now you have to remember, this was the Bay Area, one of the most progressive places in the country. And some of the people at the show were actually more progressive than people in the Bay Area. So I just wanted to see if they realized the way this show was set up, I couldn't see the bands like they could. So I sat between these two record shelves for about 2 hours, and in that 2 hours, not one single person realized that I couldn't go see the shows like they could. That was when I realized that I was invisible to my community. Now, I'm not saying I have an invisible disability, like an autoimmune disease or autism, because obviously my disability is very visible because I'm in a wheelchair. What I'm saying is that I was invisible to my community as a disabled person. And that's when I realized I needed to create a space to make disabled people's voices heard. So I started going around to the DIY communities that I had connected with over the 30 plus years, and I started telling them that you're not being inclusive if you're not including disabled people and letting them know how to include disabled people. And as time went on, I began to notice that it wasn't only my community, the DIY community, that considered disabled people invisible, but it was my entire community. So I started branching out and letting everyone know. When the COVID-19 pandemic hit last year in March of 2020, I think the illusion we all had that there was a safety net in place for us was completely shattered, and millions of Americans had to grapple with finding reliable public health information and trying to learn how to protect themselves and their communities from this virus. The sad thing is, if you are disabled or live with a chronic illness, you know very well that your reality is there is no safety net. And disabled people have fought hard for generations to create accessibility and care so they can live equal, full, and productive lives. 31 years ago, the ADA was passed, the American Disabilities Act, and it's the first law that looked at disabled people as if they had civil rights instead of people that needed to be rehabilitated until they weren't disabled anymore. Now, while I am so grateful to all the activists and people that came before me that fought hard with their bodies and lives to give me the justice or the rights I have today as a disabled person, If you do have a disability or live with a chronic illness, you know that there's so much more work to be done. The ADA needs to give disabled people more rights in areas like housing, and they need to enforce the laws that already exist, like accommodating disabled people everywhere, in the houses they rent, in the schools they attend, and in the places they work. In the early 2000s, I was able to get a job at a small independent telemarketing firm. And I was completely overqualified for this job, but due to my disability, I found it hard to get a job that I was actually qualified for, so I worked there. And I worked there for a couple of years, and in that time, my chronic pain started increasing, and I needed to be accommodated, and they didn't seem that into it. And I wish at the time I had known that according to the ADA, legally a workplace has to accommodate you if you're disabled, unless there's a burden of cost. So what that means is, let's say you get a job and it's in an office that's on the second floor and you need to get to that second floor. But let's say you have a wheelchair or chronic pain or something that prevents you from getting up those stairs. The way your workplace has to accommodate you is by installing an elevator. But an elevator could cost them $10,000 to $20,000 and put them out of business. So if they say that's what's happening, they don't have to accommodate you. But that's not what was happening to me. Because in my job, I paid for my phone, I paid for my internet, I paid for my computer, the three things I needed to work there. And really in the end, I think the reason they didn't want to accommodate me is because they thought I was going to lie about my hours. So it stings so much that before the COVID-19 pandemic happened, the world said it is too hard to accommodate disabled people. But then when the pandemic happened, non-disabled people were accommodated almost instantly. And this was about 20 years ago, what happened with my job, and I haven't had a job since. Even though we are the largest minority in this country and the world, our marginalization is continuously accepted. An example of this is a bar I went to the other day for a local business meeting. The bar is like a typical bar. It has chairs that are low, that are appropriate for a person in a wheelchair. And then they have tables that are high up that you could either stand around or sit in chairs that were made for those tables. So I scoped the bar when I got in there and I saw there was food set up on these tables that were high, on two of them. And I rolled up to the tables and this woman came and greeted me, the woman in charge of the meeting, and she was really nice and welcomed me to the meeting. But the thing is, she didn't realize she set this meeting up completely inaccessible to me. And then as the meeting went on, other business people came and started networking around this table. And they were all standing around it, talking to each other, and not one of them realized that I couldn't take part of it like they were taking part of it. My marginalization in that moment was accepted by every single person at that bar. And I know what everyone's thinking. They're like, Priya, but you have a standing wheelchair. This isn't a problem for you anymore. And that's sort of true, but here's the thing. Medicare and Medicaid rarely pay for a piece of equipment like this. I had to advocate really hard to get this piece of equipment. And most wheelchair users do not have a standing wheelchair. So if you really want to be inclusive to everyone in your community and you're setting up an event, a meeting, your business, you need to prepare that someone is going to need to be seated at that event, meeting, or whatever, because they're in a wheelchair or because they have chronic pain and can't stand too long or whatever the reason is. You know, I think we know that the pandemic taught us that our system is really broken. And now is the time to push for more disability justice. Disability justice allows us to remember that we are human. And when we look at the world through the frame of disability inclusion, we start to think in new and different ways. And that doesn't only make our communities stronger, but it makes them more vibrant. This wheelchair is an example of this. This is a great piece of technology. I mean, I'm standing and this is so great. But it doesn't really support my independence as a disabled person. You see these two pieces of equipment, the one by my chest and the one by my knees. I cannot stand unless these two pieces of equipment are in the chair. And they're a little hard to get in and out of this chair. And they're also a bit bulky and a little heavy to carry around town with me in case I want to stand. The other way it doesn't support my independence as a disabled person is, say I was out, I was standing, and I needed to go to the bathroom. I transfer because I use a wheelchair. I have to transfer to my car seat, I have to transfer to a couch, and I have to transfer to a toilet. So if I wanted to use the bathroom in public, I would have to take these two pieces of equipment out, transfer to the toilet, put them back in, and then put it back in the standing mode. So while this invention is great, it doesn't support my independence. But imagine if you had a disabled designer or a consultant talking to the people about this invention. They would inform them of that, and then people would go back and think about the independence of disabled people when they're creating something like this. Now is the time for the new normal. I think we know, or we should know, the old normal really sucked. And what does disability pride mean anyway? Pride is the consciousness of your own dignity. And how is a disabled person supposed to have dignity if they're ashamed to ask for help, if they can't get into a restaurant to eat because it's inaccessible, if they can't get a job that they're qualified for, or they have to be thankful simply because they can use a bathroom? They can't. Now is the time for us to think about the human experience in new and different ways. And now is the time for us to start doing this. So thank you so much for listening, everyone, and happy Disability Pride.